I've just finished playing through Warhammer 40,000 Boltgun on the PlayStation 5 on the channel, so it's time for another Paine's Games review, and we'll start off with a little background. Released in 2023 for all major platforms, Boltgun is an unashamedly retro first-person shooter, commonly known today as a boomer shooter, developed using Unreal 4 by Auroch Digital and published by Focus Entertainment. Wearing its heritage rooted in Doom, Rise of the Triad, Duke Nukem 3D and other such 90s shooters on its sleeve, the title joins a seemingly ever-increasing catalogue of Warhammer 40,000 games that are actually good. For those of us old enough to remember when Warhammer Fantasy Battles started in 1983, followed by its sci-fi sibling Warhammer 40,000, we have seen a fairly patchy history unfold when it comes to video game adaptations of these British TTRPG icons. If, like myself, you're of that sort of age, then you might know the disappointment of, say, Space Hulk Vengeance of the Blood Angels on the PlayStation 1, 3DO or Saturn, which teases you with the excitement of an FPS, but then you find yourself in a first-person real-time tactical shooter, an FPRTTS, if you will, ultimately satisfying neither of the aforementioned genres' key minimum requirements of fun nor playability. So this recent renaissance in Warhammer licensed property is a welcome one for myself at least, and Boltgun's appeal as an actual FPS that targets the nostalgia temple for its optical scope, not just for a fan of Warhammer 40k as a franchise, but also as an avid participant in the 90s FPS boomer shooter rage, drew my interest as it would seem it has many others, as Boltgun 2 is due to release imminently at time of recording. So, enough of the preamble, let's move on to the premise and story. Boltgun picks up some years after the events of Relic Entertainment's 2011 third-person shooter Warhammer 40,000 Space Marine. Taking on the mantle of Ultramarine Sturgard veteran Malum Kado, you are sent to Greyur by the Inquisition to intervene in the maniacal machinations of a rogue tech priest. Through his meddling, he has opened a rift in the warp through which the forces of chaos once more maraud, accompanied by a chaos sorcerer who has designs on the power source behind the rip through to the warp. Without too many spoilers, that's about the meat of the beat on this one, which I personally appreciate, as too many games these days are bogged down with endless exposition and unnecessary story, whilst Boltgun keeps it straightforward. Bad dudes want to do bad stuff, but Malum and his Boltgun have other ideas. The gameplay mechanics are really very tight, and I'm playing the base game on the PlayStation 5 to be clear, but controlling the game is intuitive and straightforward. On the controls feel tight and snappy for a console running a wireless controller. The movement is quick and smooth while also feeling very solid as the Marine's armour pounds its way about the levels, and the guns each feel unique and powerful. From the staple bolt gun to the heavy bolter, the plasma gun to the gravity gun, each weapon has progressively more aggressive and satisfying visual and rumble feedback, and at no point did they lose their feeling of authenticity or fun during my playthrough. The chainsword serves as a secondary weapon with which one can target enemies and lunge forwards, plunging the chainsword into them, which, whilst incredibly satisfying to begin with, is not really a necessity throughout the game, though it does make for both a fun addition to the combat and an occasional lifesaver should one run out of ammo. There's a decent array of grenades too, from Crack through to Vortex, which do a good job of crowd control in their busy areas deeper into the game. Along the way, you'll encounter a fair variety of enemies, from annoying little nurblings that needlessly waste your ammo whilst concurrently being a bouncing pain in the ass, particularly towards the end of the campaign where there's loads of them, to pink horrors, exalted flamers, chaos marines, aspiring champions, terminators and so on. Whilst some of them are legitimate bullet sponges, others do a great job of keeping one on the move, and there are plenty of opportunities to find oneself mobbed, particularly if lured into Leroy Jenkinsing it into a seemingly empty room, wherein one will often find classic Doom-style traps with mobs spawning in or being released from hidden rooms. In advancement through the game, Aurochs stay true to the 90s progression of requiring coloured keys for coloured doors, which will find one retreading their steps frequently, particularly in later levels, having acquired the necessary key. Thankfully, there is a handy waypointing button that will bring up the much maligned yellow paint of noobdom, though I'd posit that the most average players might use this particular function at least once at some point throughout the game, which segues nicely into graphics and environment, as some of the levels are quite labyrinthine, which in itself is true to form for both the genre and period that Boltgun targets. So whilst not a criticism, it does reinforce the handiness of the waypointing system. I should highlight at this point that I played through the entire campaign with the default graphics settings, by which I mean that I didn't adjust the in-game options that cover pixelation, retro palette and bloom. These may be self-explanatory, however they basically scale the game up from its default, which emulates quite nicely the aesthetic of a mid-90s PC shooter running in software rendering mode, with chunky pixelated textures and sharp, jagged edges bereft of anti-aliasing, all the way up to a more modern, high-definition aesthetic. With regards to the retro defaults, which as I say, I spent the entire campaign in, there are some noticeably modern elements at play within the geometry, lighting and overall presentation which bring a satisfying gloss to proceedings without detracting from the inherently retro visuals. A welcome organic quality of life upgrade on the shooters of old, aided by the smooth 60 frames per second performance I enjoyed throughout the majority of my gameplay. The environment design throughout the game is quite nice indeed, both in geometry, which feels natural and of the period for a 90s shooter, and textures. The colours and atmosphere do feel very Warhammer 40k, and the lighting is dynamic and vibrant, fitting all the weapons fire, electrical and plasma discharges, explosions, etc. perfectly. As I said in my live streams, in a market once flooded with dulled photorealistic greys and browns, a game like Boltgun jumps off the screen with its comparatively bright and colourful presentation, which given the source material stands firmly in Boltgun's favour. That's not to say that there aren't dark areas, however it's never so dark that you have no idea where anything is. Thankfully Aurochs retro reflections end at Doom 2 and ignore the utter darkness of Doom 3. The game also has good pacing between small, tight areas and large, expansive areas in which to mow down bosses and mobs. There's good use of both vertical and horizontal space throughout, with occasional jump packs dotted around that replicate the jump pads from Quake 3's behaviour, launching one across the level in a predetermined arc. There's a fair few platforming sections, some incorporating moving kill objects and others that require combination usage of running and dashcam techniques in order to traverse, and honestly, whilst never prohibitively hard, the controls are just that little too skittish and speedy to make these sections quite as fun as they could be. In comparison to say Quake or Unreal for example, whilst the controls feel great for a Space Marine, they encroach into an area of speed and inaccuracy that both hampers these sections slightly and force one's suspension of disbelief a little in how manoeuvrable the armour is, even when borne by a genetically engineered super soldier. Overall though, the presentation of the campaign in default retro mode is engaging, accurate to the period, suitably colourful and downright fun, particularly when it comes to the lashings and lashings of giblets lovingly thrown about the screen when dispatching hordes of foes. The attention to detail, from jagged edged geometry to overtly pixelated textures to even 2D billboarding of assets a la Doom, makes this homage to shooters gone by a visually bountiful feast for anyone wishing to experience an authentic feeling 90s FPS without the eye-bleeding internal render resolutions and frame rates, updated with a whole host of quality of life improvements that makes this title fit in very nicely to today's markets. Now, when it comes to the sound and music, it's a bit of a 50-50 in my experience. Starting off with the sound effects, which are superb, as alluded to earlier, the Space Marine armour feels powerful and heavy as it whirs, clicks, clunks and thuds its way around levels. The sound of a chainsaw tearing into corrupt chaos minions is satisfyingly crunchy. Shots from every weapon sound uniquely devastating, as does the splatter of infidel giblets under one's feet should one drop upon them from great enough height. It all adds up to an immersive experience that feels as authentic to the genre as much as it heightens the effect felt from the weapons, etc. The music, majoritively compositions by Matthew Walker, definitely rocks, with a blend of metal guitar riffs and stark synth sounds, booming rock drums and deep mechanical beats. The music complements the aesthetics perfectly with a range of absolutely slapping tracks, featuring the odd authentically retro sound font or effect from your staple 90s PC sound card. One could see it fitting in alongside the 9 Inch Nails Quake soundtrack work or Unreal Tournament or even Doom 2016 in places very easily. It fits the feel of the game and drives things along nicely, though there were frequent noticeable crossfades, cutouts and jumps when entering certain areas or encountering a boss fight, which can be jarring, though not a game breaker by any means. The only problem I encountered during my playthrough was that the soundtrack and even some of the sound effects were incredibly distorted at default levels, though even when adjusting these, it seemed although the music and effects themselves may actually have been using bit crunching and overdrive, and perhaps if so, rather to higher degree. It does leave everything sounding super hard. Initially this isn't all that much of a thing, but by the end of the 12-ish hours I got out of the campaign going at a casual rate, it was actually a bit oppressive. Checking with other titles, Boltgun does seem to output at a considerably higher level than others I tested on the same PS5 and capture setup by default, so that would be the only considerable gripe I can muster from my experience. Which brings me nicely to the shortcomings. First and foremost being the fog and draw distance when playing at the default retro settings. Multiple times throughout my playthrough, I found myself peering into the fairly near distance fog and entirely missing enemies that were fairly similar colouring, particularly the pink fiends in my recollection. There were also quite a few instances of enemies popping in without a spawn animation, so one cannot be sure if that was draw distance or an animation trigger error, but it happened enough times for me to notice it. Additionally, there were several areas with a purple liquid-like texture which definitely seemed to be broken, showing what seemed to be a black transparency show-through with just a colorized reflection pattern pulsing across it. I also managed to repeatedly get jammed into a few small spaces behind boxes and even a fairly open corner of a wall in the last chapter of the game. This actually happened several times in a row, merely by strafing out of incoming fire, forcing me to reload from a save point, so that wasn't ideal. That said, I have played far buggier slop in recent years, so I can forgive a few clipping issues here and there. The enemies, by the end of the game, do begin to feel a touch wearing in their limited variety. This is not to say that the enemy roster is tiny, but the last third of the game could have done with a few differing designs, weapon types and movement patterns. I would say that by halfway through the campaign, you've likely seen every enemy type that you're going to see through to the end, save for bosses which themselves tend to be a bit of a variation on the grunts, just bigger. The chainsaw, though fun, feels a little surplus to requirements for the bulk of the gameplay. Something one pulls out rarely as a last resort and more often as a fun alternative to shooting something, but still comparatively rarely considering its permanent position as a secondary weapon. It's cool, but there's not really anywhere that is particularly needed for any specific task, and it has no upgrade path throughout the game. Finally, there are points frequently throughout the game where it feels a bit like a glorified horde mode with intersecting tunnels and doors. Now, I didn't try the horde mode because, well, I don't really care for the horde modes, as I got my fill of those back when folks first got their hands on Doom WAD editors and cobbled together Infinity Pinkies, endlessly running at your gun. It was a lazy mod back then, and I find it to be a lazy game mode and worse, game genre today. So in conclusion, I'm giving Warhammer 40,000 Boltgun a 7 out of 10. This game hits all the right nostalgia spots for both fans of Warhammer 40,000 and 90s first-person shooters, whilst offering modern quality of life improvements and graphics options to lower the threshold of entry for those with no interest in emulating 90s PC graphics, but an interest in either Warhammer 40k or boomer shooters in general. It satisfies that itch for Twitch gaming without an overbearing storyline or the needless depth of time sinkage of a modern live service slopfest. It gets in there, rips and tears, and is out in a tidy time period, leaving one hopeful for a sequel that expounds upon the foundations laid herein. And that's why this gets a 7, as whilst easily above average in today's climate, there are still some clear areas for potential growth and improvement. For example, local split-screen campaign co-op and online deathmatch on CTF would be awesome, offering somewhat more replayability than the current game. A wider range of enemies and vehicles would be very welcome addition too. Some broader variety of environments wouldn't go amiss, as by the end of the campaign I was feeling a slight fatigue at the predominantly reddy orange and bluey purple seen throughout. Now I know there's a DLC and I may well give that a go too, as I did really enjoy this, but this review is based upon the base game. If you can pick up Boltgun for under $10, then it is well worth the purchase, and now's a good time as the sequel Boltgun 2 is due out soon, and I for one am looking forward to playing it, but that's a game for another video. Thanks for tuning in, goodbye now.